Mother refused to care for my son during my surgery, called me a burden, and went to a casino. The phone felt heavy in my hand as I stared at my mother's contact information. I took a deep breath, fingers trembling as I pressed call. Hello. Her voice was sharp, impatient. Hi, Mom. It's me. I hated how small my voice sounded. At 32, I still reverted to a child around her. I know who it is, Ellie. What do you want? No warmth, just Linda being Linda. I glanced at Jake, my 6-year-old son, building a Lego tower on the floor. He looked so much like his father, the same dark curls, the same dimple. David had been gone for 3 years now, taken by a drunk driver. Just like that, I became a widow and a single mother overnight. I need to ask you a favor, Mom, I said, lowering my voice. I found out I need surgery next week. It's my gallbladder. They need to remove it. Silence on the other end. Mom, I heard you, she replied. So, what does that have to do with me? I swallowed hard. I need someone to watch Jake while I'm in the hospital and during recovery. The doctor says I won't be able to lift anything. And you immediately thought of me, she interrupted. Of course you did. You're his grandmother, I said, trying to hide my desperation. And you're his mother, she shot back. Figure it out, Ellie. I raised you by myself after your father died, didn't I? I bit my tongue to stop from pointing out that my father had left her well off financially when he passed 15 years ago. I never saw a penny, not even for college. According to her, there hadn't been much left after funeral expenses and debts. Mom, please, I said. It's just for a few days. Jake loves spending time with you. Does he? Or is that what you tell yourself? She sighed heavily. Ellie, I'm 63. I've done my time raising children. I have my own life now. I wouldn't ask if I had any other option, I said, hating the pleading in my voice. My friends all work full-time, and I can't afford a caregiver. There it is. She laughed without humor. You always expect me to clean up after your messes. This is what happens when you make poor life choices. My poor life choices. That was her way of referring to Jake, my beautiful son born when David and I were struggling financially. We weren't married yet, and Linda made it clear she thought I was ruining my life. She never warmed to David, even after our wedding, and after his death, she hardly acknowledged Jake beyond obligatory birthday cards. Mom, Jake is not a mess. He's your grandson, and I need help. I'm scared. My voice cracked. You're always scared, Ellie. Always needing something. It's exhausting. Tears stung my eyes. I've never asked you for money. I've never asked for anything. But I'm asking now because I need help with my son while I have surgery. Silence again, and I let myself hope. I'm going to Atlantic City next weekend, she said finally. Marlene and I have had it planned for months. Paid in advance. I closed my eyes. The surgery is on Tuesday. You could still go after. No, Ellie. I can't. Can't or won't. The words slipped out. Don't take that tone with me, she snapped. I'm not the one who got pregnant before I was ready. I'm not the one who married a man with no life insurance. Stop, I whispered, glancing at Jake. Just stop. You're a burden, Ellie. You've always been a burden. Her voice was cold, matter of fact. You think I don't know what this call is really about? You want me to take care of your problems, like always. Well, I'm done. Figure it out yourself. The words hit like physical blows. I had always known, deep down, that my mother viewed me as an inconvenience. But hearing her say it out loud shattered something inside me. I see. I managed, my voice hollow. Enjoy your trip. I will, she replied. And Ellie, don't call me again for a while. I need a break from all this drama. The line went dead. I sat there, tears streaming down my face. How could my own mother be so cruel? Mommy? Jake's small voice broke through. Are you crying? I quickly wiped my eyes and forced a smile. No, sweetie. Mommy's fine. Just tired. I opened my arms, and he abandoned his Legos to climb into my lap. I buried my face in his soft curls. Did you talk to Grandma? Is she coming to see us? My heart broke again. Jake had few memories of Linda, but he was always excited to see her. He craved a grandmother's love, especially since losing his father. "Grandma is busy, honey," I said carefully. "She has a trip planned." "Oh." His face fell before brightening. "Maybe next time?" "Maybe." I lied, hating myself for giving false hope. That night, after tucking Jake in, I sat with a cup of tea, trying to figure out what to do. The surgery was necessary. My gallbladder attacks were becoming more frequent and painful. I couldn't put it off. The next morning, I baked blueberry muffins and walked next door with Jake to the Dawsons. Mrs. Dawson was a retired teacher who sometimes watched Jake when I worked late. "Mrs. Dawson?" I asked when she opened the door. I hate to impose, but I have a huge favor to ask. I explained my situation, trying to keep steady. When I finished, I braced for rejection. Instead, Mrs. Dawson took my hand. "Oh, Eleanor. Of course I'll help. Jake can stay with us while you're in the hospital." "Are you sure? It's a lot, and he can be quite energetic." "Nonsense," she said firmly. "My husband and I would be delighted. It gets too quiet around here." Relief washed over me, followed by intense gratitude that brought fresh tears. Later, I checked my phone. My mother had posted on Instagram a photo of herself and Marlene, shopping bags in hand. Pre-vacation shopping spree. Atlantic City, here we come. #treat yourself. I stared at my mother, smiling broadly, spending money she always claimed not to have. Money that could have helped with Jake's preschool tuition when I was struggling after David's death. In that moment, something hardened inside me. My mother had made her choice, and someday I would make mine. The hospital ceiling tiles became my world for 3 days. Each one had a unique water stain or crack, my personal constellations during sleepless nights when pain medication wore off. The gallbladder removal was supposed to be routine, but complications arose. A small infection meant extra days under fluorescent lights, away from Jake. When they finally discharged me, I shuffled into Mrs. Dawson's car like an elderly woman, hunched and fragile. "Jake's been wonderful," she assured me, helping me with the seatbelt. "He's been helping Mr. Dawson in the garden. They're growing tomatoes." I smiled weakly. "Thank you again. I don't know what I would have done without you." Mrs. Dawson patted my hand. "Family isn't always blood, dear." The word family stung. My phone remained silent throughout my hospital stay, no calls or texts from my mother. I checked social media once and immediately regretted it. Linda had posted a video of herself at a blackjack table, chips stacked high, captioned, "Winning streak. Living my best life." My best life was currently 4 prescription bottles and a heating pad. At the Dawson's home, Jake launched himself toward me before Mr. Dawson gently intercepted him. "Remember what we talked about, buddy? Gentle hugs for Mom." Jake approached cautiously, eyes wide with concern. "Does it hurt bad, Mommy?" "Not too bad," I lied, carefully embracing him. "I missed you so much." "I missed you too. Did Grandma visit you at the hospital?" The innocent question pierced deeper than my surgical wounds.
"No, sweetheart."
"Grandma's still on her trip."
"Oh."
His small face clouded. "She doesn't like us very much, does she?" Out of the mouths of babes. "She." I hesitated, unwilling to burden him with adult complexities. "She shows love differently than other people." Jake seemed to consider this. "Mrs. Dawson says love is what you do, not what you say." I swallowed the lump in my throat. Mrs. Dawson is very wise. The Dawsons insisted I stay another night, and I gratefully accepted. My apartment stairs looked insurmountable in my condition. The next morning, Jake was helping Mrs. Dawson bake cookies when my phone rang. Not my mother. My Aunt Margaret, my father's sister. "Eleanor, thank goodness you answered. I just heard about your surgery from Barbara at church. Your mother didn't tell anyone." "Hi, Aunt Margaret," I said, easing myself onto the Dawson's porch swing. "I'm fine, really." "You're not fine. You had surgery. I'm coming over tomorrow." "Where are you staying?" After explaining my temporary living arrangement, I listened to Aunt Margaret's outrage about my mother's absence. Unlike Linda, Margaret had always been warm, though distance and my mother's interference meant we weren't close. True to her word, Aunt Margaret arrived the next day in her ancient Buick, arms laden with casseroles and a stuffed dinosaur for Jake. "You look terrible," she announced, setting food in the Dawsons' refrigerator, which is completely normal for someone who just had surgery and has no family support. I managed to smile. "The Dawsons have been wonderful." "Thank God for good neighbors," Margaret said, giving Mrs. Dawson an appreciative nod. "But Linda should be here. Your father would be appalled." Jake had taken his new dinosaur outside, giving us a moment of privacy in the Dawsons' guest room where I was staying. "Mom's always been like this," I said, carefully adjusting my position on the bed. I shouldn't have expected anything different. Margaret pursed her lips. "She wasn't like this when your father was alive. He kept her grounded." I remembered little of those days. I was only 17 when Dad died of a heart attack. I barely remember them together. "They had their issues, but Howard adored you," Margaret said, sitting beside me. "That's why he was so careful with his will." Something in her tone made me pause. "His will?" "Of course. You know, your dad wanted to make sure you were always taken care of. He talked about it all the time before he passed." She patted my hand. At least Linda managed that part properly. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "What do you mean?" Margaret looked confused. "The trust fund. For your education and eventual inheritance."
My heart began to pound.
"Aunt Margaret, I never received anything from Dad's will. Mom told me he left us with almost nothing after debts were paid." Margaret's face transformed from confusion to shock to fury in 3 seconds flat. "That's impossible. Howard left the house paid in full, his retirement accounts, and a separate trust for your education. I was there when he signed the papers with his lawyer." Blood rushed in my ears. "Are you certain?" "Eleanor, he made sure you'd be taken care of. There was even a provision that you'd receive half of everything when you turned 25, which was, 7 years ago?" The room spun faster. All those years struggling through community college, working 2 jobs, accumulating student loans. The hard years after David died, when I could barely afford Jake's daycare. My mother's constant claims of financial hardship while she took cruises and weekend getaways. She lied. I whispered, the words burning my throat. She stole my inheritance. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Eleanor, you really didn't know?" I shook my head, unable to speak. The betrayal was so complete, so overwhelming, that physical pain radiated through my chest. "I need to see that will." I finally managed. "I need proof." Margaret squeezed my hand. "We'll find it, but first you need to heal." That night, as Jake slept peacefully beside me in the guest bed, I stared at the ceiling. My mother hadn't just abandoned me in my time of need. She had been stealing from me my entire adult life. Every struggle, every financial hardship, every sleepless night worrying about bills had been unnecessary. As anger replaced shock, a new emotion emerged: determination. For the first time since my father died, I felt his presence, as if he were whispering, "Fight back, Ellie. It's time." Sleep finally came, and with it, resolve. My recovery had just taken on a new meaning. 3 weeks after my surgery, I finally had enough strength to drive again. Jake was back in school, and the Dawsons had reluctantly allowed me to return to my apartment, though Mrs. Dawson still appeared at my door every evening with dinner. I hadn't heard a word from my mother. Her social media showed she'd extended her Atlantic City trip by a week, then gone directly to a spa resort. Living her best life, indeed. Aunt Margaret's revelation haunted me. Was it possible my mother had hidden my inheritance for 15 years? The logical part of me wanted proof before jumping to conclusions, but my gut knew the truth. It explained too much. "I'm going to my mother's house today," I told Margaret over the phone. "She keeps all her important documents in her home office." "Are you sure that's wise?" Margaret asked. "Linda won't take kindly to you snooping." "She's in Sedona until Friday," I replied. Posted pictures of her sunrise yoga session this morning. Besides, I still have a key from when I watered her plants last summer. Margaret was silent for a moment. "Be careful, Eleanor. If what we suspect is true, Your mother has gone to great lengths to hide it." I drove to the suburban house where I'd grown up, my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. The two-story colonial looked exactly as it always had, pristine landscaping, fresh paint, not a shingle out of place. My father had bought it the year I was born, the crowning achievement of his successful accounting career. The key turned smoothly in the lock. Standing in the foyer, I was struck by how little had changed since my childhood. The same formal furniture, the same family photos, though I noticed most recent ones featured Linda alone or with friends, not with Jake or me. I headed straight for the home office. The door was locked, unusual, but not surprising given what I now suspected. Thankfully, I knew where the spare key was kept, in the hollow bottom of a decorative vase in the hallway. Some things never changed. The office was meticulous, like everything else in Linda's world. Her desk contained current bills and correspondence, nothing from 15 years ago. The file cabinet yielded nothing suspicious either. Tax returns showed only her pension and Social Security income. Where would she hide something she never wanted me to find? I stood in the center of the room, turning slowly. My father's presence felt stronger here. He'd spent countless evenings at that desk, going over family finances. What would he do? Where would he look? The answer came suddenly. The floor safe. Dad had installed it years ago, hidden beneath a small area rug under the desk. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the twinge from my healing incision, and pulled back the rug. The safe was still there, but I didn't know the combination. Sitting back on my heels, I considered my options. Breaking into the safe wasn't possible. I needed the combination, which meant thinking like Linda. What would she use? Not my birthday. She barely acknowledged it most years. Not her wedding anniversary. She'd practically erased my father from her life after his death. Then it hit me. My father's birthday. She would choose something she'd never forget, but that I wouldn't easily guess. I dialed the month, day, and year of his birth. The safe remained locked. I tried the same numbers in different orders. Nothing. Frustrated, I leaned against the desk. My gaze fell on a framed photo I hadn't noticed before. Linda and a silver-haired man I didn't recognize, standing on a beach. They looked intimate, comfortable. I picked up the frame, something tugging in my memory. A small label on the back read, Aruba, 2015. I suddenly remembered Linda's excited phone call that year about meeting someone special on vacation. Richard? Robert? Ronald, that was it. They dated for nearly a year before he moved to Florida. I turned the frame over in my hands, noticing it was heavier than it should be. Examining it closer, I realized the back panel was thicker than normal. I pried at the edges until it popped open, revealing a small notepad hidden inside the frame. On the notepad, in my mother's perfect handwriting, were various passwords and combinations. And there, at the bottom, floor safe, Howard death date plus birth year. My father's death date and birth year. I felt a cold wave of disgust wash over me. She'd used his death as her security code. I dialed the numbers with shaking fingers. The safe clicked open. Inside were several folders and a stack of jewelry boxes. I recognized my grandmother's pearls and the diamond earrings my father had given Linda on their 20th anniversary, pieces she'd claimed were sold years ago to pay debts. But it was the folders that held my attention. The first contained investment statements showing accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, all in Linda's name alone. The second held property deeds for a vacation condo in Florida I'd never heard about. And the third, labeled simply Howard, contained my father's original will. With trembling hands, I opened it. The legal language was complex, but certain passages stood out with perfect clarity. To my beloved daughter, Eleanor Grace Mitchell, I leave a trust fund in the amount of $250,000 for her education and future security, to be accessible to her upon her 21st birthday. The family home at 1428 Oakwood Drive shall remain in my wife's possession until such time as she remarries or passes away, at which point ownership shall transfer to my daughter. Upon my daughter's 25th birthday, she shall receive 50% of all remaining assets and investments.
The room spun around me.
I'd struggled through community college classes at night while working days. I'd taken out loans I was still paying off. After David died, I nearly lost our apartment because I couldn't make rent, all while my mother was sitting on my inheritance. The last page of the will was the most damning, a handwritten letter from my father to me. "My dearest Ellie," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm no longer with you. Know that I've done everything in my power to ensure you'll be taken care of. Your mother has promised to honor my wishes. I hope this helps you achieve your dreams without financial burden. All my love, Dad." I clutched the letter to my chest, tears streaming down my face. He had tried to take care of me. He had loved me. And my mother had betrayed us both. I set the documents on my kitchen table, arranging them in neat piles like exhibits in a courtroom. For 3 days after discovering my father's will, I'd been methodically gathering evidence, photographing everything in the safe, making copies, and securing the originals in a safety deposit box only I could access. With shaking hands, I dialed a number I'd found through careful research, Hamilton and Associates, one of the top estate litigation firms in the state. "Yes, I need to speak with someone about a contested will," I told the receptionist. "It's urgent." 2 days later, I sat across from Rebecca Hamilton herself, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s whose reputation for fierce litigation preceded her. Her office walls displayed not family photos, but framed newspaper articles about cases she'd won. "So let me make sure I understand," she said, reviewing my documents. "Your father died 15 years ago, leaving you a substantial inheritance that you never received. Your mother told you there was nothing left after debts, while secretly maintaining control of the assets." "Yes," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I have the original will, investment statements showing regular withdrawals, and property deeds for assets I never knew existed." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "This is one of the most clear-cut cases of inheritance fraud I've seen. The will explicitly states you should have received access to your trust fund at 21 and half of all remaining assets at 25. She looked up at me. "You're what, 32 now?" "Yes." "So we're talking about 7 years of lost access to your inheritance, plus the educational trust you should have had earlier." She made calculations on a legal pad. "With compound interest and potential investment growth, the financial damages are substantial." "I don't care about the money," I said, though it wasn't entirely true. "I want justice." I struggled for years, especially after my husband died, while she was spending my father's money on luxury vacations and casino trips. Rebecca set down her pen. "Mrs. Mitchell, in my experience, people who say they don't care about the money usually care very deeply about what the money represents. In your case, it's your father's wishes being honored." She paused. "And there's your son to consider."
Jake.
Throughout this nightmare, I'd been trying to shield him from my fury and heartbreak. Mrs. Dawson had been watching him while I attended this meeting, keeping him distracted from asking why Mommy was so sad lately. "You're right," I admitted. "Jake deserves the security my father wanted for me. For us." "Then let's proceed," Rebecca said. "First, we'll send a formal demand letter to your mother, outlining the evidence we have and the legal consequences she faces. She'll have 14 days to respond before we file suit." "She'll fight it," I warned. "She's stubborn and manipulative." "They always are," Rebecca replied with a slight smile. "But they rarely expect their victims to fight back with equal determination." As I left the law office, I felt a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. For 15 years, I'd been the dutiful daughter, swallowing Linda's criticisms, accepting her lies. Now I was declaring war. The demand letter went out by certified mail the next day. While I waited for the confrontation I knew was coming, I hired a forensic accountant Rebecca recommended to trace every penny of my father's estate. The results were staggering. "Your mother manipulated the probate process," explained Martin Greenberg, the accountant. "She submitted altered versions of financial statements and created fictional debts to make it appear the estate was nearly insolvent." Rebecca studied the documents. "This goes beyond civil fraud. There are criminal implications here. Submitting falsified documents to a probate court is perjury." "I don't want her in prison," I said automatically, then paused, surprised by my own hesitation.
Do I?
That's not a decision you need to make today, Rebecca assured me. Let's focus on recovering your inheritance first. Martin cleared his throat. I should mention that your mother's spending has accelerated dramatically in the past 5 years. The investment accounts are down to about 40% of their original value. She's burning through it, Rebecca translated, probably sensing she's getting older and wants to enjoy it while she can. The thought of my mother deliberately depleting my inheritance ignited a fresh wave of anger. Can we freeze the accounts? Once we file the lawsuit, yes. We can request an emergency injunction to prevent further dissipation of assets, Rebecca explained. But we should wait until after the 14-day window for her response to our demand letter. 2 days later, as I was helping Jake with his homework, my phone rang. Linda's name flashed on the screen, the first contact since before my surgery. How dare you? She hissed when I answered. I received your lawyer's little threat today. I took a deep breath, signaling to Jake to continue working on his spelling while I stepped into my bedroom. It's not a threat, Mother. It's a legal notification of what rightfully belongs to me. I raised you. I gave you everything. Her voice was shrill with indignation. After your father died, I was the one who kept a roof over your head, food on the table. With money he specifically left for me. I interrupted, my voice cold. Money you stole. I did what was necessary, she insisted. You were too young, too irresponsible to handle that kind of inheritance. I was 25 7 years ago, Mother. The age Dad specifically designated for me to receive half of everything. There was a moment of silence before she switched tactics. This is about the surgery, isn't it? You're punishing me because I couldn't drop everything to babysit. The casual dismissal of both my medical crisis and her grandson as a babysitting issue pushed me over the edge. This is about 15 years of lies and theft. This is about you calling me a burden while spending the money my father left to make sure I would never be one. You ungrateful little. You have 12 more days to respond to the demand letter. I cut in. I suggest you consult with a lawyer. You're going to need one. That night, I received an email notification from the forensic accountant. Subject line: Urgent. Account activity alert. My mother had attempted to withdraw $50,000 from one of the investment accounts that afternoon. I forwarded the email to Rebecca with a single line. Time to file. The next morning, Rebecca's firm filed an emergency petition to freeze all assets connected to my father's estate. By afternoon, a judge had signed the order. My mother's financial war chest was officially under lockdown. The battle had begun in earnest, and I was finally fighting back. 3 months after filing the lawsuit, we were still deep in the discovery phase. Linda had hired an aggressive attorney who filed motion after motion to delay proceedings, but Rebecca matched every tactic with counters of her own. The temporary freeze on assets remained in place, much to my mother's fury. She's getting desperate, Rebecca told me during our weekly update call. Her lawyer called yesterday, fishing for settlement terms. I'm not interested in settling, I replied, watching Jake build a fort out of couch cushions in our living room. We'd moved to a slightly larger apartment the month before, not because of any inheritance yet, but because my improved health allowed me to pick up extra shifts at work. Hear me out, Rebecca said. We have her cornered legally. The evidence is overwhelming. But court cases can drag on for years, especially when someone's fighting for their financial survival. I considered this. What did her lawyer propose? Nothing specific yet. They're testing the waters. Rebecca paused. But there's something else you should know. Our investigator has been monitoring your mother's activities. And she's planning another casino trip to Mohegan Sun in Connecticut. Apparently, she's convinced one of her friends to loan her money since her accounts are frozen. I laughed bitterly. Of course she is. This could work in our favor, Rebecca said slowly. If we time this right. The plan took shape over the next week. Rebecca consulted with a colleague who specialized in criminal fraud, while I struggled with conflicting emotions. Part of me still couldn't believe I was orchestrating my own mother's downfall. But then I'd remember Jake asking why we couldn't afford new soccer cleats, or the nights I'd gone hungry to ensure he had enough to eat. Are you sure about this? Aunt Margaret asked when I explained our strategy. It seems severe. She stole from me for 15 years, I said firmly. She let me struggle while she lived in luxury. And when I needed her most, she called me a burden and went gambling. Margaret sighed. I know, dear. I just worry about you carrying this anger forever. This isn't about anger, I insisted. It's about justice. The following weekend, Linda headed to Mohegan Sun with her friend Marlene, just as our investigator had reported. She'd been increasingly agitated since losing access to my father's money, posting passive-aggressive social media updates and sending me hostile text messages. But her gambling addiction wouldn't be denied, even if she had to borrow to feed it. Saturday evening, I received a text from our investigator. Subject at high-stakes poker table. Down approximate $4,000 already, but still playing. Perfect timing. I took a deep breath and called Rebecca.
She's there.
It's time. Within 30 minutes, Rebecca had activated the next phase of our plan. A court officer, accompanied by 2 local police officers and our forensic accountant, entered the casino floor. They approached the poker table where my mother sat, chips stacked in front of her, cocktail in hand. Our investigator, positioned nearby, captured the moment on video. Linda's face when the officers approached her table. The confusion turning to shock as the court officer presented her with legal papers. The way she tried to gather her chips as if they could protect her. The humiliation as other gamblers stopped to watch. I wasn't there to witness it firsthand, but the investigator's report and discreet video told the story clearly enough. Linda was served with not just the latest court orders freezing additional assets we discovered, but also a notice that the district attorney was opening a criminal investigation into her probate fraud. You can't do this to me, she reportedly shrieked, causing heads to turn throughout the casino floor. That money is mine. I earned it. Those words, captured on the investigator's recording, would prove damning in court. Not there's been a mistake, or I don't know what you're talking about, but an admission that she believed my father's money was rightfully hers. The officers escorted her from the casino. Her friend Marlene, unwilling to be associated with the scene, pretended not to know her. By Sunday morning, my phone was exploding with notifications. Linda had been released from questioning but now faced potential criminal charges. Her lawyer called Rebecca in a panic, suddenly eager to discuss settlement terms. She's offering to transfer the Florida condo to you immediately, Rebecca reported, and to acknowledge your right to the house once she passes away. Not enough, I said firmly. She wants to live comfortably while giving me scraps. I agree, Rebecca replied. We can do better. On Monday, I received a text directly from my mother. You've ruined me. I hope you're happy. I didn't respond. Tuesday brought another. They're saying I might go to jail. Your own mother. Is that what you want? Again, I didn't engage. Wednesday. Please. I'm begging you. Call off your lawyers. We can work this out. By Friday, Linda's bravado had completely collapsed. Her lawyer called Rebecca with a new offer. Linda would sign over all remaining assets immediately, including the house, in exchange for immunity from criminal prosecution and a modest monthly stipend to live on. It's everything we asked for, Rebecca told me. Plus, she's willing to sign a full confession about the fraud she committed. Why the sudden capitulation? I asked, suspicious. The DA showed her the video from the casino. Her exact words, caught on camera, were damning. And your father's original attorney has come forward with his copies of the will and trust documents, which match ours exactly. She has no defense. I thought about Jake, about the security this inheritance would provide him, about the justice my father would have wanted. Accept the offer, I said finally, on one condition. What's that? I want to be there when she signs everything over. I want to see her face. 3 days later, in Rebecca's conference room, I came face to face with my mother for the first time since before my surgery. She looked diminished somehow, her designer outfit hanging loosely on her frame, her makeup not quite concealing the dark circles under her eyes. Eleanor, she said stiffly, I hope you're satisfied. Not yet, I replied, watching as she signed document after document, returning control of my father's estate to me at last. But I'm getting there. Spring arrived in a burst of cherry blossoms and fresh starts. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in Rebecca's conference room when my mother signed away her ill-gotten gains. The legal transition had been swift once she capitulated, property deeds transferred, accounts unfrozen and redirected to my name, the family home now legally mine. I stood on the front porch of that house, my house now, watching Jake chase butterflies across the lawn. We'd moved in 2 months ago, after extensive renovations, to cleanse the space of Linda's presence. Fresh paint, new furniture, family photos featuring Jake and me instead of my mother's self-centered displays.
Mom.
Look at this one. Jake called, cupping his hands around a monarch butterfly that had momentarily landed on a flower. At 7, he was thriving in his new environment. Enrolled in a better school district, taking swimming lessons at the community center, his bedroom filled with books and toys I could finally afford. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I called back, smiling at his wonderment. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Final accounting report is in. Your father's estate, fully recovered minus your mother's spending, totals $1.2 million in assets plus the property values. Congratulations." I typed back a simple, "Thank you for everything," before slipping the phone into my pocket. The money itself had never been the point, though the security it provided had transformed our lives. What mattered was reclaiming what my father had intended for me, the love expressed through his careful planning, his desire to protect me even after he was gone. "Eleanor." Mrs. Dawson's voice called from next door. She appeared at the fence line, waving cheerfully. "I made too many blueberry muffins again. Would you and Jake like some?" "We'd love some," I replied, smiling at my dear friend and neighbor. The Dawsons had sold their home and moved next door to us after I offered to buy them the ranch-style house they'd always wanted. They'd protested at first, but I'd insisted, explaining that without their kindness during my surgery, I might never have discovered the truth about my inheritance. As Jake ran to collect the muffins, my thoughts drifted to my mother. After the settlement, Linda had moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. The monthly stipend we'd agreed to was enough for basic necessities, but nothing more. No more luxury shopping, no more casino trips. Just enough to prevent her from becoming homeless. She'd called several times in the beginning, alternating between tearful apologies and bitter accusations. I'd stopped answering after the third call. Some wounds were too deep for simple forgiveness, some betrayals too fundamental to repair with mere words. Last week, however, an envelope had arrived with Linda's handwriting on it. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small key I recognized instantly, the key to my father's safe deposit box at the bank, something I hadn't even known existed. The letter read simply, "I kept this from you too. I'm sorry for everything. The box contains your father's watch and some letters he wrote to you before he died. You should have them. Linda." I'd visited the bank yesterday, opening the small metal box with trembling hands. Inside, as promised, was my father's prized Omega watch, the one he'd worn every day of his adult life, and a stack of sealed envelopes addressed to my Ellie. Letters for life events he knew he'd miss, my college graduation, my wedding day, the birth of my first child. I'd sat in my car in the bank parking lot, reading through them one by one, tears streaming down my face. His words were everything I'd needed to hear during those milestone moments, proud, loving, wise. He'd known he was dying long before he told anyone. The letters revealed his terminal diagnosis, the careful planning he'd done to protect me, his trust that Linda would honor his wishes. In that moment, I'd felt both profound sadness for his misplaced faith and deep gratitude for his enduring love.
Mom.
"Mrs. Dawson says we can come over for dinner tonight. Can we?" Jake's voice pulled me back to the present as he raced up the porch steps, a basket of muffins in his hands. "That sounds wonderful," I replied, ruffling his hair. "Tell her we'll bring dessert." As Jake ran back to deliver the message, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but the area code was local. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hello. Eleanor? It's your mother." I almost hung up, but something in her voice, a brokenness I'd never heard before, made me pause. What do you want, Linda? Her voice caught. I wanted to know if you found the letters. If you opened the safe deposit box. I did. He loved you so much, she whispered. I was jealous of that. How much he adored you. It wasn't right what I did. I know that now. I remained silent, unwilling to offer absolution. I'm moving to Arizona next week, she continued. My sister offered me her guest house. I won't bother you anymore. I wanted to say goodbye. And I'm sorry. For everything. The line went quiet. I could hear her breathing, waiting for a response I wasn't ready to give. Goodbye, Linda, I said, finally ending the call. I watched Jake laughing with the Dawsons across the yard, his face bright with joy. Some relationships shouldn't be salvaged. But new ones could be built stronger than before. That evening, as we sat around the Dawsons' dinner table, Jake regaling them with stories from school, Mr. Dawson teasing me about my failed attempt at making tiramisu for dessert, I felt my father's presence more strongly than ever. To family, Mrs. Dawson said, raising her glass in a toast. The ones we're born with, and the ones we choose. To family, we echoed. As I sipped my wine, I glanced out the window at the house my father had provided for me. The inheritance wasn't just the property or the money. It was this moment, this security, this peace, this chosen family. She had called me a burden, but I was finally free of the heaviest burden of all, her. I had everything my father wanted me to have, and that was enough.